I was always fascinated by randomly generated worlds. There's the promise of an infinite expanse, endless new places to discover, maybe luring with the premise of something we don't get to do in the modern world, exploring unknown territory and making it our own. We take these expectations from the real world and apply them to the game world, like picking a random direction from your home and just heading out. You could find anything. But we all know the catch. Procedurally generated environments in games are often bland. They're paradoxically repetitive. They feel shallow, erratic, empty, maybe even dissonant in how one place doesn't fit to the next. They don't resemble the outside world, where everything in this second is the result of a second that came before it. We see a snapshot of an infinite chain of events. Minecraft evokes a timeless wonder. It feels like it was one of the few games that was able to deliver on the often made promises of an infinitely explorable world. But what's the secret? Why do most generated virtual worlds feel disconnected and insipid? And how can there be this one outlier, the one title that kept its promise? On this journey, we're looking for nothing less than the meaning of life. A player character's life starts at the new game screen and ends with the credits. Some conclude with a goal, some with the last bit of a story, some are able to continue on forever. After all, not all good things have to come to an end.
You may have noticed, 1982 is Information Technology Year.
Many other titles tried to do what Minecraft apparently succeeded at. We can trace back the development of explorable procedural worlds to 1984, when most people didn't have a personal computer at home, to a system called the BBC Micro. It was designed for educational purposes first, but was also marketed for entertainment. Whatever you could make work on a 2 MHz processor and 32 kilobytes of memory. One of such games praised as a technological marvel was the spacefaring action title Elite, created by David John Braben and Ian Bell. Trying to build an engaging 3D interstellar flight sim and trading strategy game with 8 galaxies and roughly 2,000 planetary systems on the limited hardware of the BBC Micro was quite a challenge. In the 80s, Elite was what we call a system seller today, reviewers proudly announcing that it's worth buying a BBC just to play it. To prime players for its complex world and mechanics, science fiction author Robert Holdstock was commissioned to compose a novella that was distributed with each copy. In The Dark Wheel, players could get a first insight to trading, combat, and reputation, from the initial harmless to the top-of-the-line elite. So how do you fit the intricate details of hundreds of thousands of planets, space stations, economies, and ships on a data cassette with barely 120 kilobytes of storage? The answer is, you don't store the entire universe on cassette tape. You store the instructions to create the universe instead. Computers don't do random. Everything is determinate, and randomness a believable illusion. This fact is leveraged to bind the infinite parameters of a generated world to a single input, the seed. A seed is a numeric value put into a generator, and that generator then uses it to calculate a sequence of seemingly random numbers. The trick is that the same seed as input will always produce the same number sequence as output. Only changing the input seed will change the produced numbers. This makes it possible for Elite to use pseudo-random number generation for its vast game world, while the world itself is still the same for everyone. The seed is fixed, so every player who sat down at their BBC Micro in 1984 and the years and ports following after could visit the same galaxies, while they were never stored on any disk. What they had stored was not any galaxy, but only the potential for a galaxy. the instructions to create the universe on the fly. When Elite came out, it blew critics' minds. A video game in 3D running on a home computer where players could fly through an entire universe with a web of interconnected gameplay mechanics. It was a milestone and completely unique. Its status also meant that there was barely anything it could be compared to. But since its release, other titles too tried to build their interactive environments on procedural generation. Today we have games with massive hand-built lands and cities, side by side with games where spaces are assembled by rules and random numbers. Removing the human direction and explicitness of a handmade level removes control. Suddenly we can no longer ask, why did the level designer put this here? Suddenly there doesn't have to be a purpose. Much of intention is replaced with chance. What was design is now nature, where things just fall into place because that's how they fell. We can try to define what we're actually expecting from a content generator when we play. Some questions about what works for and what works against our enjoyment, believability, and our immersion. Does the content feel intentional and meaningful? Does the content endorse and reinforce core gameplay? And does generation provide an advantage over pre-built spaces? To understand what exactly we're looking for, it helps to find a most basic example to break apart. A good reference point for less systemic and more random levels are the fields in the Microsoft classic game Minesweeper, created by Robert Donner and Kurt Johnson, first made available in 1990. If even something plain could have the magic of making a level appear believable and purposeful, anything more complex surely could. And if not, we might be able to build our analysis from there. Every time a new game of Minesweeper starts, a random board is generated. The underlying algorithm may have a lot of hidden complexity, producing challenging but not impossible puzzles, not letting the first tile the player clicks on be a mine, trying to eliminate the need for guessing tiles. There's quite a bit we're not seeing. But at its core, it's a strictly functional design. Not much goes into a level besides the chosen difficulty setting, parameters like number of mines and board dimensions. In contrast to Elite, the seed is also different for each game, and the chances of two players seeing the same board twice are low. While this approach serves its purpose for a modest puzzle game, there's no sense of meaning in the form of the board or in the placement of mines. It's abstract and technical, but using random elements works to enable the core gameplay. It makes things suitably unpredictable. It serves a purpose, but gives us not much more. Games that let their entire world be generated systemically are the outlier. Many more just use elements of generation with handmade content side by side. Blue Bottle's post-apocalyptic survival game Neo Scavenger applies some of the magic through a simple hex-based map with one tile per location. After waking up in an abandoned cryo facility, selecting your abilities and flaws, and escaping a menacing dog man, you eventually make your way outside without any sense of direction. You can wander around and scavenge the inviting landscape of devastated Michigan State and its lineup of ruined houses, office buildings, forests, lakes, and fields. And occasionally, you end up wandering into special story locations. Here, the game switches to text adventure mode, where what you see and feel is presented in first-person dialogue, and available actions and skills to use are plainly laid out. The gameplay loop comes down to exploring, finding gear, and satisfying your many bodily needs, from hunger to warmth to treating your wounds received in accidents and combat. What isn't apparent from the outset is that Neo Scavenger is actually a linear story game below the surface. The core gameplay is not endless. There is one ending. There is story progression. And despite there being multiple ways to complete the journey, you'll have to go through a lot of the same points of interest on the way. While the map does look randomized, story hexes will always be in the same position, and what happens there will also always be the same. What is random per game are scavenging tiles, loot, and enemy encounters, but the main experience still runs as a thread woven by hand. If anything, Neo Scavenger even goes overboard in being far too random, while expecting you to make it through a linear story. The landscape might not have what you need. Any random enemy may leave you badly wounded, and one wrong decision in an encounter can be your sudden end. While the world itself is fun to explore from a mechanical standpoint, the generated content is more there to fill the gaps than being the core of the experience. It's the fixed locations and pre-made monsters that make the impression. A game that pushes procedural generation much further is the community project Cataclysm: Dark Days Ahead, created by Kevin Granade, the commonly recognized post-apocalyptic player-focused survival sibling of Dwarf Fortress. Here you play a fully customizable survivor with a selectable prior occupation and personal background, and are point inserted into a virtually infinite, somewhat present-day end of the world, offering different landscapes, cities and towns, all with enterable houses with their own layout, countless items to collect, and even drivable and modifiable vehicles. In the background, the entire world is assembled from tiles that connect like jigsaw pieces. You have towns with roads and highways connecting cities, interior layouts with rooms you'd expect in a suburban home, with living rooms, bathrooms, a stocked kitchen with items in every shelf and cupboard. It achieves a notable consistency where houses look like houses and cities look like cities. In Elite, we're blasting through space at a quarter of the speed of light, constantly discovering new things and commuting from station to station. The world is almost abstract and doesn't quite give us enough detail to ascribe meaning, to connect with on a deeper level. It's an even worse case looking at Minesweeper. No place to bond with an arrangement of grey squares and call it home. In Cataclysm, we spend time with the generated environment. We remember where we began our adventure, the first house we entered, the first spot we had a close encounter, the first shelter we sat down to read a book. A good world needs features to remember. It's the detail that makes the difference. Hyped beyond belief at the time before its launch in 2016, No Man's Sky was announced as an open-world space exploration game with lofty goals and even loftier expectations. Also among these promises was precisely what Elite had decided against at the advice of its publisher Acornsoft, when the team aimed to include 281 trillion galaxies instead of the more comprehensive 8 galaxies of the final release. This project strived to go even further and set ambitions to 18 quintillion visitable planets. Every atom procedural was the first line of marketing text shown in the announcement trailer in 2013. A bold claim made by young British studio Hello Games, accompanied by promotions focusing a lot on the systemically generated universe, and not quite as much on mechanics, quests, or goals. Its newly assembled audience was expecting an intriguing set of star systems, space stations, and planets to explore, beautiful vistas and strange life forms to see. But a game that's all viewing and no doing will struggle to rise to any higher status than that of a tech demo. Despite the imminent uproar following No Man's Sky's release, the pitch made in these early trailers was still reasonably accurate. Besides flying and fighting, it never gave a fulfilling answer to the core question: what do you actually do in this game? The game was announced just around 3 years after Minecraft had climbed to its beta phase and international adoration in 2010. From announcement trailers and pre-recorded gameplay demos in 2013, it would take until 2016 for No Man's Sky to release. Besides negative reviews, inaccurate advertising, and a myriad of technical shortcomings, the game was plagued by the most prominent flaw of randomly generated worlds. It felt completely meaningless. Reviewers at the time would describe the flawed gameplay loop as a torturous chain of gather resources, to gather more resources, to gather more resources, with not much more for personal fulfillment than hopping from one place to the next, in everything you do working only to enable your next escape, an escape that sometimes couldn't come soon enough. No Man's Sky was immortalized as an expensive demonstration of good on paper, not in practice, and even though it later went on to be patched and expanded, the flaws at its core are just as present years later. The one memorable thing is the immense letdown you feel when you realize the most interesting parts of landing on an uncharted planet are the moments before you land. A smooth and shaded sphere often evolves into a jagged mess on approach. Chunks of land flicker in and out of existence. One ugly brown rock becomes a more detailed and even uglier brown rock. The game might not have any loading screens after booting up, but that doesn't mean it won't still have to load the place you're going to. But spaceflight is just the lesser half of the game. Most time is spent outside your ship, on the surface, and it took me a while to really pinpoint what exactly was missing, to recognize what I was expecting to see. Games with handmade open worlds usually try to mimic a believable, natural look. They give the illusion that everything has shifted and grown following natural laws, where valleys are lush, mountaintops are barren, forests grow in humid areas, and rivers divide the land and ultimately lead to lakes and oceans. What No Man's Sky is missing are distinct points of interest. Once you land, there aren't any immediate places to go to. The land looks the same under your boots as it does as far as render distance permits, which is not very far at all. Distant mountains never tower, they're more minor waves of terrain. Vegetation, rocks, and even artificial structures look more like they've fallen from the sky than having organically evolved, grown, or been cultivated or built. The land is also missing separation, a line where one thing ends to make room for another. It's noisy, unappealingly chaotic, and it all starts to blend together quite quickly into one grey mass. Its bleak reality is that it's devoid of anything remarkable. Even though its generator was purpose-built to reproduce a kind of proceduralism of nature, the results feel surprisingly artificial. If planets have their own laws for evolution, a story of how its plants and animals came to be, it's a story not told inside the game. In an effort to balance the game for players landing on relatively unpredictable planets, the development team had to counteract even more of the perceived randomness to realize their vision of gameplay. Every planet needs to have the resources to refuel your ship and be able to leave it again. Every planet needs to have oxygen to refill your life support systems. Every planet needs buried caches for base building. Trees can't be too big, mountains can't be too high. When you use your scanner, you're never more than a few hundred meters away from what you might need, which is a plus when just walking around is already a chore. You thought you were a pioneer of space exploration, but every planet you land on already has settlements and abandoned alien structures. The whole universe has already been colonized, and you're nothing but a tourist. The desire to explore is a shared responsibility. One half of it is carried by the player, the other by the environment. When considering the meaning of a world, we can stop in any spot of just one of the available 18 Quintillion planets and ask, Why is this here? The Atlas may be the god entity of the universe, but can still not carry it on its back. A prominent text about the secrets of coding a generator was written by Dr. Kate Compton, who was technical artist of the 2008 life simulation strategy game Spore by Maxis. Compton calls this process making an artist in a box. She proposes to first focus on the things to be generated. She calls these things artifacts. And especially in the realm of interactive media, we shouldn't just lay out what general properties an artifact has, but also what makes it special and what makes it generic. Asking what it could have that makes it captivating and what makes it undesirable. We can arrange these attributes by how crucial they are and how they might depend on each other. The final properties our outputs just cannot exist without are the generator's constraints. Something that is highlighted early in the author's text is the human component. A generator is only worth as much as its produced artifacts are recognized and valued by a human observer. This leads into what Compton coins the 10,000 bowls of oatmeal problem. It's trivial to generate thousands of bowls of oats, each with a slightly different weight, with every individual piece sitting in a different position and orientation. Every one of these bowls is technically unique, but at the same time, indistinguishable to a human viewer. To the observer we're generating content for, all bowls would look the same and taste the same. What makes this issue hard to solve is that the output cannot be judged by a computer. A landscape is appealing when someone finds it appealing. Absolute realism is also not an ideal bar, because in the context of a game, even a flawless replica of a physical landscape isn't necessarily interesting or accessible. We can try to classify the state of an artifact on a scale from fungible, where it cannot be told apart from any other output of the same kind, to differentiable, where it is perceptually distinct, to memorable, where it is also perceptually unique. In an ideal case, an artifact that is memorable is also characterful. It has something that can be pointed at and talked about. For a landscape, that could be a defining landmark, like a massive volcano, or another scenic point that is somehow more remarkable than any others. In the case of whole planets, a player would prefer a local maximum of some kind. Climbing the highest mountain of a planet sounds much more appealing than climbing to the peak of 100 average height mountains. Enough has been said about the pre-release statements of Hello Games. From interviews conducted during the rising hype for the game, it becomes clear that the team may have had a different priority all along. We could say they succeeded, but were tuning their generator for the wrong goals. A sense of nihilistic scale, a sense of awe. It seems they wanted players more to look and marvel than to play. The merely passing presence these planets would have may have been the intention all along. As founder Sean Murray said, people will stop playing long before even 0.1% of everything has been discovered. That's just how games are. It's a sad thought though. When we fly through the galactic map, we see all the stars, each of which will have planets around them, and life, and ecology, and the vast majority will never be visited. At some point, the service will be shut down. It will all be turned off, and it will be us who pull the plug. A new game in Minecraft is very different from most other games. There's no opening title, no cutscene, no introduction text, no characters, no mention of a story. You click single player, you click create new world, skip over an offering of advanced options, and watch an appropriately square loading screen. Only its colossal success stands against the brazen design flaw that the game requires explanation before it can be enjoyed. It's a title so popular, it transcended the need for a tutorial before it had time to add one. By law of its acclaim, it's physically impossible to be more than 20 meters away from someone deeply familiar with every last mechanic and able to recite the entirety of the community wiki from memory. Where many games go as far as packing the most stunning parts into the first hour and highlighting presentation over gameplay early on, Minecraft dares to just let you spawn facing a cliff. The fact you're plunged into a world no one has seen before when creating a new world is apparent right away. We can compare it to other survival games with reduced player guidance, like The Long Dark. Everything here is initiated and sustained by player motivation. A personal goal formed freely, then resculpted between the embankments of the game's mechanical design. For all of these, you'll know what your first steps might be. The gameplay may be familiar. With a vast, yet pre-built playspace like in The Long Dark, elements in the world may be randomized, but the world itself will be constant. A sense of wilderness will eventually diminish. In contrast, a new Minecraft world is always a step into the unknown. Despite having to assemble the landscape with blocks, the environment feels believably wild. There are different biomes, countless small variations. There's always at least one major point of interest that sticks out, something that feels worth visiting, and accidental landforms that may only occur once in the whole map. When you discover something, you really feel like you've discovered something. It's notable how its generation works at scale, from a bird's eye view from the top of a mountain, but it also works where it matters the most, on the ground, in the deepest valleys, beneath the treetops, sneaking through the underbrush. We've learned that a generator's output, the artifact, needs to ultimately be judged by a human observer. Comparing it to just the average vista of other games makes it clear how well the results come together. It's easy to ascribe meaning to it. The endless assembly of blocks from the level seed becomes a landscape. And as we build, the landscape becomes a home. The possibility to create something from nothing is an innermost charm of Minecraft. No matter how stunning the initial scenic view might be, it's merely a starting point. There's no mechanic in the game that isn't a close union with the playspace in one way or another. The foundation of it all is the ability for transformation, to build on top, into, and with the space. By weaving its gameplay directly into the generated world, it's no longer just a necessary backdrop, but an integral part of the game's main appeal. The artifact becomes undismissible by being tethered to all other mechanics. This design directs our attention to the landscape, a motivated engagement that makes the connection feel personal. We can see this reflected in every detail. From the very beginning, our first crafting table needs wood. We're directed to a forest. The need for shelter directs us to find a suitable spot for our first house. The need for rare materials directs us to explore our surroundings and descend into dark caverns. The generated space plays a leading role in every moment of the game. Taking a walk through the procedural forest is being on the hunt for opportunity. What makes it special is how every player also walks a different forest. For a game played by hundreds of millions of people, only the tiniest fraction ever get to see the same view as someone else before them. Though even with millions of different new games played, there is still a strong shared experience in the game's community. The first YouTube Let's Play series I've ever watched was one of Minecraft. Before an exhaustive catalog of mods existed, before texture packs and shader support, players shared their first steps into this whole new world of the Minecraft alpha.
And this is like #1 priority right now.
Just like No Man's Sky can't seem to stray too far from what was first playable on launch day, the heart of Minecraft also has not changed with time.
Nope. Dang it. Really could have done without that.
If we exclude all of the game's structures, the villages, temples, strongholds, shipwrecks, and other late additions, there are no prefabricated assets in the environment. Nothing we can just recognize and dismiss until we have investigated and seen it for ourselves. It's a space that never repeats, not even across all the levels created, from the oldest playthrough to today. It's fascinating to think that every long-running playthrough out there starts with whatever the generator just so happened to create initially. Hundreds of adventures work from this foundation, a foundation that was not designed, but produced from a random seed number. Players unconsciously pass a cave that later becomes a primary set piece in their story. And if just one digit in the seed was different, it would have produced an entirely different world and another experience with it. All we get to see, all the places that grow so familiar to us, they all start here. Now, to try to wrap up all these thoughts, a generator's quality is always subjective because it produces content for a subject. We need intentionality, a sense of meaning in the result. For a game, we want the generated content to reinforce core game mechanics, and ideally, the generator provides an advantage over creating the content by hand, removing predictability and repetition. The maps created in Minecraft offer perceptual uniqueness. It might seem that having to rely on blocks to make the world would restrict variety, but in practice, the opposite is true. Using blocks seems to allow for a much finer and controlled approach in generation. Maybe it makes bigger changes easier to realize. Maybe the size of blocks makes smaller differences stand out more, and even a reused design can feel like new with little effort. Climate zones and biomes create a lot of visual distinction, especially in the transition zones between. Most crucially, the what we can do stands a long way before the where we can do it. The game's mechanics are built around the procedural space. The world is transformable, and all change is permanent. The player holds the same power as the generator itself, from bedrock to atmosphere. Watching players over the years, it seems the world is treated like a natural landscape, with no predefined right path to spot and follow, no minimaps or quest markers. All planning and guidance must come from the player themselves. It is possible to fail. Not all paths lead to success. There are possibilities, but no guarantees, disorientation, and opportunity. All this gives a sense of exploration that feels notably real. Minecraft's terrain generation manages to hit a golden middle ground between repetitive patterns on one side and pointless randomness on the other, something few games achieve. Maybe it's the magic that gives this one above the rest, unshaken cult status, and unfaltering longevity.